And with that, I am going to introduce Jodi Koberinski as the moderator. Jodi, MES, is a public scholar and activist working at the intersection of climate, food, water, energy, and colonialism. Currently, Jodi is pursuing a PhD at the University of Waterloo through the SSHRC Doctoral Fellowship. So with that, I'll pass it over to Jodi.
Great, thank you, Alex. I welcome everybody. I want to just quickly apologize on behalf of myself and the other organizers about the confusion around the time. We had one time in the program and we had another time in the other communications, but we managed to gather everyone here who's together and joining us, so very grateful for everyone's patience, in particular to our panelists, Kim Thalberg and Eriel Tchekwie Deranger, and our moderator, Kira Lightning, for your patience with us as we scramble in this world. It would have been lovely to have been together in person at this time. I'm also really grateful we have this model and this way of gathering, and it sets up some opportunities to be much more inclusive in the future. So we will iron out the kinks in this as we move along. So how this is going to go, I'm going to give a quick overview of some of what we heard over the last few days to set the stage for Kim and Eriel and Kira, so that they understand a little bit of what we've been engaging as a scholarly society over the last 3 days. And then Eriel is going to give us a 10-minute set the tone, because as you'll hear through this introduction, there's some connections that Eriel already has to CANSI. For those who were with us in Waterloo, she was a keynote speaker and set some really great wheels in motion from the things that she had to say there. So we wanted to bring her back here and reflect on that process, and then we invited Kim in to sort of reflect more broadly on what she's hearing as well. So over the last 3 days, we've heard a lot of things. In our opening keynote, we heard from Dori Tunstall with the project It's My Future Toronto, where youth got together with education, industry, and government to guide discussions on racism and COVID responses. And she spoke to the importance of giving opportunities for Indigenous, Black, and persons of color youth to see themselves as designers and not just consumers. We heard from Jodi Singh, who said that climate justice cannot be seen in isolation. It means also social justice. He listed a number of Indigenous sites of resistance across Indigenous lands, Canada, and reminded us that Indigenous struggles in of themselves have their own integrity, and that collective liberation means climate justice. He also called on us to have clarity about the structures of power, which he named as colonialism and capitalism, and the entire political, bureaucratic, and corporate class in service to those two powers, insisting that we need to target those systems of power for transformation and not accommodation. That was a really powerful way to open up this conference and set us up. And then our last speaker that we heard from at that time was Kyle White, who pointed out that somewhere in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 climate change actions taking place in 2020 across what are called the United States of America by Indigenous peoples, who only make up a fraction of the population. And he spoke to the injustice of that imbalance in terms of who's not only bearing the brunt, but who's taking responsibility to address that. He also asked us to consider that climate science is one of Indigenous people's oldest ways of knowing. He spoke to the ways that Indigenous governments is dynamic, and that Indigenous societies are adaptive and conducive to landscape, organizing to best approximate the dynamics of ecosystems rather than seeking to control them and contain them. Over the 3 days of this conference, we heard from macroeconomists, makers, and meditators. We learned about soils, sustainable development goals, and sowing seeds for just food futures. We held problem labs and a degrowth extravaganza. We heard various points of view on concepts like just transition, degrowth, mutual aid, and climate justice. We heard about the climate policy collaborative project between Indigenous Climate Action and researcher Jen Goby and her team, from which we learned about the need for integration of Indigenous worldviews into Canadians' capacities for understanding and thus honoring our responsibilities and the need for relationship as academics and participants in Canadian society. This final conversation that we're convening right now with Kim Thalberg and Eriel Tchekwie Deranger is hosted by Kira Lightning, who is a graduate student at University of Alberta and a member of the Samson Cree First Nation. Kira, who is supervised by Kim at the University of Alberta, has been working with Indigenous Climate Action on the Indigenous Economics Reclaiming the Sacred Conference, which is going to be held in 2 weeks. And I imagine that Eriel may have an opportunity to talk to you a little bit more in her time. And Kira and I are going to be working on a paper together to really contest this idea of Indigenous economics and how it will be informed by the upcoming conversation that we're going to be having with community. So I'm noticing we've got a couple of minutes before it's 6:30, and I'm just going to take a quick moment to say a few words about Kim and Eriel, because I think if folks haven't had a chance to look at their bios, I want you to have a sense of the powerful women that we have at the table with us today, and what a privilege it is, and an honor, and also much gratitude for being able to sit with these three women. So Kim Tallbear joined the faculty of Alberta to work with one of the strongest groups of Indigenous studies scholars anywhere in the world. There are 1,100 Aboriginal students at the university and many Native faculty and staff in multiple faculties on campus. Kim was awarded in 2016 the Government of Canada's Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Environment. And she's an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wampanoag in South Dakota. Kim is also descended from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in the Oklahoma Flandreau Santee, and was raised on the Sioux Reservation in South Dakota, St. Paul, Minnesota, by her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Her scholarship focuses on the ways in which genetic science is co-constituted with notions of race and indigeneity, as discussed in her new book, Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of a Genetic Science. And so we'll get to hear a bit more from Kim. Folks should check out her bio if they haven't. And we also have Eriel Tchekwie Deranger. Eriel is a Dënesůłiné. I'm sorry, I'm a nervous person online. Eriel is a Dënesůłiné woman. She's a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation and a mother of two, coming from a family of Indigenous rights advocates, and I would say powerful Indigenous rights advocates, fighting for the recognition, sovereignty, and autonomy of their Indigenous lands and territory in what is now known as Treaty 8 in Canada. In 2015, Eriel worked with local Indigenous organizers to help build out the foundations of Indigenous Climate Action, becoming one of the co-founders of the organization and formally stepping into the role of executive director in 2017, and continues that work today. Eriel has been very generous in her work, both across communities within Indigenous communities, but also in doing the bridge work with settler communities and including organizations like CanSee. And it's been a real pleasure to work in a way to transition some resources towards ICA to set up this upcoming Indigenous Economics Reclaiming the Sacred Conference. So Eriel, I'm going to invite you to take the floor now, and then when you wrap up, Kira, we're going to hand the microphone over to you, and I'll just be over here listening. Thanks so much for everyone's attention, and I'm excited to hear what's next.
Masicho Glanete Dënesòłiné Eriel Tchekwie Deranger Hasli. Again, thank you so much. My name is Eriel Tchekwie, and my name is Adene name, and in my language it means Thunder Woman. And I belong to the Deranger family, which is a colonial name, Deranger, from the French missionaries that named us and colonized our territory. And our family's traditional name is actually Dënesòłiné. And we come from Treaty 8 territory in the northern parts of so-called Alberta. I like photos with my presentation, so I'm going to have photos because it just helps me with things. And I'm a storyteller, I'm a visual person, and it just really helps. So these are my grandfather's moccasins. My grandfather's passed away, but I'm wearing these moccasins in the Northern Territory of Australia on the red soil there. And I feel like it's a really good picture because I've had the opportunity to travel across the world and meet many Indigenous peoples in their territories that are advocating and fighting for the recognition, not just of their rights, but of who they are as valuable citizens to society. In the Northern Territory, they are fighting fracking, the fracking of their entire territory for, a dirty fossil fuel that is going to contribute to global climate change. And it was so interesting to be in these places, because when I think about these places, oh, I need to push play. I just realized you can all see my little things on the side. Technology doesn't always work. And it's just like remembering our own homelands when we're away. So I come from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, but my territory's in a process of trying to reclaim our traditional name, which is Kaitale Dënesòuliné. And Kaitale means people of the willow. And it's a reference to the Athabasca Delta, where we come from, which is largely marshlands, boreal forests. And it is one of the last remaining inland freshwater deltas in the world. It's recognized by UNESCO for its rich biodiversity and its cultural significance to the planet. And yet, our community continues to struggle with having recognition of our stewardship and rightful responsibilities to our lands and territories. And these aren't simply places. This idea of Indigenous lands and territory are not simply places to own and to manage and determine what resources and how much money we can make and what kind of wealth. But these are the places that have nurtured us since time immemorial. This is a photo of me and my siblings. I'm the one standing on the rock looking in the opposite direction on the south shores of Lake Athabasca on the eastern side in northern Saskatchewan, where my family would spend many of our summers in a walled tent out in the bush, learning about the land, but learning about who we are, because the land is inseparable from our identity. These places have nurtured us, they have guided us, they have taught us the languages of the water, the trees, the medicines, and all of our relatives that live within these lands and territories. As Kaitale Dënesòuliné, we are inseparable from the land. The chief of my nation, Chief Allen Adam, has once said that if you destroy the Athabasca Delta, then who are we? It is that idea that we are entirely inseparable. But we are a part of many Indigenous peoples with their own unique stories of origins and evolution. And there are over 5% of 5% of the global population is Indigenous peoples, and upwards of about 500 million people worldwide. And that represents over 5,000 distinct languages in over 90 different countries. And Indigenous peoples occupy and use between 22 to 60% of the land surface. And they utilize that because our land is a part of our identity. It is not something to be safeguarded somewhere else, but it is intrinsically a part of all of our aspects of our lives because we are inseparable. What that has resulted in is that 80% of the world's biodiversity is within Indigenous lands and territories, and 85% of the world's protected and conservation zones is within or adjacent to Indigenous territories. And this is not by coincidence. Furthermore, Indigenous rights that we are now have international affirmations of within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples further really solidifies that relationship with land that is weaved throughout the entire UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this is a unique international convention because it was created by and for Indigenous peoples in partnership with states, but it is the only UN convention that was created by what is sort of known as civil society, and in this case, Indigenous peoples. And what's really neat or interesting about this is that it highlights free, prior, and informed consent. And this has a lot to do with ecological economics in a minute, which I'll get to, but it's important to understand what free, prior, and informed consent is, because in Canada, in so-called Canada, we get stuck on the big C all the time. Did they give consent? Did they say yes or no? And we don't even ask for consent in Canada. We've downgraded consent to consultation. Did you talk to them? Yes or no? But in actuality, the international rights that Indigenous peoples have are free of coercion, intimidation, and manipulation. The right to say no, prior, meaning well before projects have even been thought out, or policies or economies have been thought out, and informed, that all aspects of these undertakings are given to us with enough time in languages that are accessible, and that we are able to digest these things before we decide whether or not we want to participate and proceed. However, that's not the history of this country. We're all led to believe that Canada is created on this premise of these beautiful agreements between the indigenous peoples and the settlers, where we all shook hands and we agreed to share and manage the lands and territories. And these treaties look like, there's many, many treaties across the country. The most well-known one are the number treaties, and we talk about these things all the time. But what we don't talk about are the fact that there is still much of Canada that is untreated. These are untreated territories. And even within the treaty territories, these agreements were to share and manage the lands and territories together. We were supposed to be in partnership, nation to nation agreements. And within the context of the yellow parts of this map, these are areas that have never been treated, meaning that the reality is in relation to one of the first treaties, which was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, they said that they would not take up any land in this territory of so-called Canada without a treaty, which means that this land should be within the control and ownership of Indigenous peoples. However, instead of sharing and managing the land, what we've seen is 0.2% of Canada is actually under the jurisdiction of Indigenous peoples, and the other 99.8% is Crown land. We have been dispossessed of our abilities to develop our own structures, not just for managing the land, but for what it means to develop economies, systems, and structures that have nurtured our communities and peoples for thousands of years. What we are seeing is that we live in a country that is essentially stolen land. It is a celebration of white supremacy. It is a celebration of colonial violence. It's a celebration of ongoing land theft and of Indigenous genocide. And what happens when we are dispossessed of our abilities to manage and participate in the development of economies and structures is that we see projects like this that are so disconnected from the idea of being a part of nature, of looking at these lands and river systems and the medicines and the animals that exist on them as kin, and seeing them merely as things to exploit and extract for the benefit of in hyper-individuality, notoriety, and the accumulation of wealth, which are counterintuitive to the values of our communities. I just like this slide because I think it's funny, because that photo was a picture of the tar sands, which is one of the projects that's upstream for my community. And for many of our communities, it's like tar sands, WTF. These are projects that just don't match the values of our communities of reciprocity, of kinship, and relationship. And that for thousands of years, those relationships with the land are built on this, some of the best and richest science in the world, which is Indigenous knowledge that has been accumulated over generations of living in a particular environment and developing those kinships and systems of reciprocity. And the value that this has, this kinship and this relationality that has developed, is critical in this time in the world right now, considering we are faced with the global climate crisis. Where Indigenous peoples have been able to safeguard and protect our lands and territories, and the rich biodiversity within them now represents over 312 billion tons of carbon that's being sequestered from the atmosphere. This is some of the richest things that we could offer to our planet that is much better than talking about how much dollars and how much money we can create within these structures. And within that context, just thinking about Canada, placing it, Canada's boreal forest, which is the inhabited by many Indigenous peoples, sequesters 22% of the world's carbon emissions annually, and we have a place. It's not just about saving something somewhere else. Indigenous peoples of so-called Canada have a huge role to play, not just in climate stabilization, but of reimagining what economies of tomorrow can look like. However, while we represent less than 5% of the world's total population, we wield enormous influence of the well-being of natural resources on which we depend. We manage 28% of the world's land surface and de facto guardians of 80% of the biodiversity. And this is necessary for us to achieve some of the biggest goals that are being put forward within the UN level. But these are not just forests. These are not just places that need to be protected. Like I said earlier, this is the territories of the Tahltan and the Blackfoot and the Assiniboine and the Algonquin and the Maliseet and the Inuit and the Chipewyan and so on and so forth. This is not just the boreal forest and a carbon-rich place to thrive. It's not just, we can't relegate it down to how much carbon we can sequester, but we have to think about the human relationships and the kinship and the reciprocity that has allowed these places to maintain the biodiversity that we so desperately need. We have to look at who have been the major influences to this destruction of these territories that have upset these things. And we look at the anthropogenic footprint in Canada, and you can see that it's largely along the border in southern Canada where many of our cities are. But you see in Alberta, we have this massive blight on this map, and you start to see, what is it? These are the economic sectors that drive this country, that are complicit in the destruction of the biodiversity and the Indigenous communities that live there. And not just that, but a destruction of those kinships and relationships and the economic and food security systems and spiritual systems that have existed there since time immemorial. We have to understand that Indigenous peoples that have been recognized worldwide, yet we continue to suffer disproportionately high levels of land insecurity. Going back to that 0.2% is what we actually have control over in this land, and the other 99.8 is under the federal control. And we make up some of the world's poorest people when you come from a Western idea of wealth. Our people are criminalized for speaking up against our territories, for deciding we don't want these economic systems that have been forced on our communities for thousands or for hundreds of years, and that we are asserting our rights to return back to those relationships of reciprocity, to return back to those systems of economies that are more about relationships. Economies are a foreign concept. These are ideas about returning to right relationships with the land and each other. And so we see our people saying we need to honor our treaties, we need to honor our rights, we need to stand up to these industries, and we need to reimagine what economies of tomorrow can look like by drawing on the rich histories of the trade routes, of the systems and the structures of relationship and kinship that drove the economies that were here prior to colonization. We have to abandon the colonial myth that innovation and economies and structures did not exist on Turtle Island until colonization started. Indigenous peoples were innovators, we are scientists, we had economies, we had governance, we had some of the best education systems in parts of North and South America. And we even developed things like the baby bottle nipple, syringes, basketballs, lacrosse, so on and so forth. And we are not talking about going to some long ago past. We are not static human beings, and we have to reimagine a future that pushes on the boundaries of colonial economic systems and science, and invites and emerges what it means to uplift Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous ways of being, of kinship and relationality, to reimagine what our systems of tomorrow can look like. That is the tenets of what ecological economics really is. We have to break down the barriers of the myth of understanding that Indigenous peoples, we have been devalued, demonized for hundreds of years, and we are important people with knowledge systems and ways of being that are just as important as systems of colonial white supremacist ideologies. And we must push back, otherwise we run the risk of continuing to push ourselves over the edge into complete global climate collapse, because the current economic systems are structured on systems of capitalism, extractivism, upholding tenets of white supremacy and colonization. We must absolutely rethink what tomorrow can be. Thank you, Masicho.
Thank you, Eriel. That was an amazing presentation. I'm just going to introduce myself quickly, and then I'm going to pass over to Kim to hear your thoughts. My name is Kira Lightning. I'm from Samson Cree Nation. As Jodi said, I'm a master's student at the University of Alberta, and I've been working with ICA on the Indigenous Economics Conference that's happening in less than 2 weeks now, and I'm happy to be here. Kim, do you want to jump in and give us some of your thoughts on the presentation?
Oh, sure. I thought you were going to come back with some questions. I mean, it was a lovely presentation. I don't know that I'm the best person to respond at first. I am having a bit of a crisis of faith in the last month, and which doesn't mean that I think that I come from a non-evangelical culture. And so just because I am having a crisis of faith does not mean that I would tell others to think or feel the way that I do. So yeah, I was writing down a lot of notes. I do have a lot of notes, but I don't know. I'd rather not start from a more pessimistic place. Do you mind, Kira? Do you have, and then I can jump in, but it was, thank you for that history lesson though. For me, like, I know some of this stuff, but I've only been here 5 years. And so it was very helpful for me to see that overview of the sort of articulation of, extractive industry and history and treaties and all of that. I really was beautiful. Thank you. Sorry, Kira.
Okay, I'm sorry. I do have questions I can bring up.
Okay, I do have a lot to say, but I'd rather bring it up in the context of your questions rather than come out with this sort of why I'm having a crisis of faith these days. I don't want to do that because I don't want to leave people with that. I'd rather leave them with what Eriel has. So.
Well, regarding your work in ecological economics, I was curious if you could tell us a bit about your work on the new materialisms and how you would relate that to Indigenous economies.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I don't know how familiar people in this, this group are with new materialist work, but I would not place myself within that with sort of the set of non-Indigenous, quote unquote, Western thinkers who are attempting to describe non-animate things in terms of being vibrant. So a lot of, non-Indigenous thinkers or Western thinkers in the academy in particular are very committed to, they're really committed to, I guess, what I would call a secular and a very biological worldview, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. It doesn't mean that we all have to be committed to that, right? So they're trying to find a way to discuss the vibrancy of non-animate things, of non-living things in their worldview in a way that's not resorting to spiritual language or life force language. And I was encouraged by that. 10 years ago when I started getting into that literature, I thought, okay, now, this is a moment when Indigenous and non-Indigenous thinkers can sit at the table. And I just insist on us using our languages, right? And whether that's the way we speak in English or whether it's the way that we can theorize out of Indigenous languages. And I encourage my students, even though like I'm a very low level Dakota language learner, I encourage my students, because we have a Cree language requirement at the University of Alberta, to theorize in Cree. They have to work on the language. I think this is very important because worldviews are contained in a language, and there is a lot that we can't say in English. And so we resort to words like spirituality and sacred. And I dispute the kind of veracity of those words, I think, in Indigenous languages. But nonetheless, I think we are at a moment when if you've got non-Indigenous thinkers reaching for a way to reanimate the rest of the world, not just organisms, right, but rocks, stars, soil, I think that's a really good moment to have these conversations. Like, I don't mean to be cliched, but I'm glad they're catching up. So that's kind of why I'm really interested in having conversations with people that consider themselves new materialist thinkers, right? And those conversations have been interesting. And I feel like Indigenous thought has been somewhat well received, as long as we can both be comfortable with the fact that some of us are going to have a more spiritual language and others might have a less, and that's okay, right? We don't have to evangelize to each other about what words to use. You can come to an approximate understanding of each other, even without using the exact same language, which is a very, again, non-evangelical way of doing things. And I think the academy needs to watch its evangelism, just like the church needs to, and just like the settler state needs to. All of it is evangelistic. And Indigenous people are not interested in your evangelism because, as Eriel's shown, you don't get it right. It's been very violent and very deathly. So, and not death in a good way. There is good death. Like, there's a time for everything to die, but there's been these uneven kinds of deaths and premature deaths and violent deaths and death that's not part of the cycle of life. So that's my answer, Kira.
I like that you bring up the spiritual language, because that's something I see, and I only got to go to a few panels within CANSI, but I saw that emerging already in the conversations about what language people use around trying to create these ecological economics and how it can start to become a more spiritual language and trying to avoid that. I wonder if either of you, Eriel or Kim, want to talk more about that in the context of economics or in any other way.
I think, like, first off, because we talked a little bit about this in our sort of pre-meeting, I think like when we try to like even like frame like indigenous economics versus ecological economics and putting these definitions and framework around them, so I come from a long line of indigenous activists, whatever, advocates for the land, but it's because like as indigenous peoples that are trying to continue to assert our existence like as the first step, but that our existence is valuable to society as like the second step, and that our existence is not singular. It is not a unique individual thing. Our existence is a part of a biosystem, like a biome or a region or an environment. And then it gets sort of reframed and restructured under white academic colonial frameworks to be like coined as like indigenous economics or, indigenous knowledge. And for us, it's just being, it's just living, it's just participating. And, it's so frustrating because there's this huge movement within sort of activism and social justice work around moving towards intersectional frameworks of addressing challenges. But indigenous models of like moving towards the recognition of our rights has been intersectional from the beginning. We are intersectional. It is not just about advocating for the recognition of our existence. It's about recognition of our economic systems, our education systems, our spirituality, as Kim talked about, because like even that, like it's not, we're not able to contextualize it in the context of the English language. Like I'm learning Dene now, and the words for creator and spirituality, they're hard to define. They're hard to translate over into the languages. And that's because they're concepts where we're trying to literally label and divide and separate all of the parts of the world so that we can control them. And within indigenous cosmology and ideological perspectives, it is not about control. It's about being in relation. It is about systems of reciprocity and kinship. And when we talk about these structures of indigenous economics or ecological economics, there is still this move towards separation, moving things and defining them and putting labels on them, utilizing the modalities of Western academics and data collection and science that still devalues the ways in which indigenous folks have lived in relationship and have collected and stored and transmitted our data, i.e. storytelling, experiential experiences. And within that, there is a move where people are like, well, how can we collect indigenous knowledge? How can we like decide which indigenous knowledges can help develop economies or climate solutions or all of these things? There's still this desire to divide who we are as indigenous peoples into sort of categories that can move and continue to keep the systems of colonial structures in place, but that looks like we're in partnership, but it's still pushing us and pulling us apart as opposed to welcoming and meeting systems of relationship and reciprocity and kinship.
So, Kira, the question again was to say more about the language of spirituality. Was that right? Yeah, I think partly what goes on is when European thinkers and people came here to the Americas, and it seemed, I mean, they already had this system of dividing what they could see and touch and feel from what they couldn't see and touch and feel, what you had to have faith in, I think. And I think there was also this total lack of respect for the kind of depth and veracity of indigenous knowledge about this place. And you can't see everything that's material, right? You can't see everything that's energetic. And so I think there was this kind of disowning of indigenous knowledge that was not immediately apparent to European thinkers into the realm of the spiritual. So you know, I was, one of the examples that I really love is, I was going to do a book on this and then I just didn't get around to it. I started working on other stuff, but I spent parts of a couple of summers at the Pipestone quarries in Minnesota. And I was born in Pipestone, Minnesota. And that's also where the quarries are, where a lot of the stone is harvested for ceremonial pipes. And we know that people throughout the Americas were getting pipes and pipestone from that quarry. It is now under the control of, I think, 23 federally recognized tribes, but it is Dakota centered and Dakota run. And one of the quarriers there that I was talking to was somebody who isn't really into the language of spirituality. And he was saying that he talks about both about geology, what we would call geology in English and in the West, as stories within the land, the stories that are embedded within the land. And he said, we can tell stories about the history of this land and why this stone is like it is. And we have the stories of geology. We also have stories from Indigenous people there that are both kind of creation stories, but that are also cognizant of the changes in the land. And so he thinks a lot about, and so when he talks to scientists or he talks to spiritual people, to him, he's engaged in storytelling about that place. And storytelling, of course, does not mean fiction. And I think that, you know, that kind of way of approaching knowledge production and relations is I just find it so resistant to that kind of spirit material divide. And he also questions the sacred discourse around pipes. And so one of the things we know is that the pipe, Sundance, other kinds of ceremonies were made private. Why were they made private? Well, because our spirituality was outlawed, right? And there was a serious price to pay for doing it. One of the things I think we still do is keep these things private, kind of in the way we keep sexuality private. Can we imagine a time when our ancestors didn't have to privatize all of that? They didn't have to hide all that. Maybe they didn't have to resort to the language of the sacred. It was just making relations. To have sex is to make relations. Hopefully good relations. Hopefully it's consensual and mutually desired. To smoke a pipe is to make relations too. That's what it was about, circulating relations. And you can think about the medicine that comes out of smudging in a pipe and all of that. You can think about the material aspects of that. You can think about the making relation aspects of these things. But it becomes sacred in a sense. I'm putting this out there. Let's think about it. Does it become sacred when it becomes kind of divided from the materiality of relations, from the materiality of medicine, and when it has to be hidden away because settlers outlawed everything? So I do think there's a need for us to interrogate the language of the sacred in English. And I also think by rooting our thinking back in Indigenous languages, because they contain worldviews, it's what is contained in our ancestors' languages is so much more mind-blowing than what is contained in English language of the sacred and the spiritual. That's what I think. And I think when you talk to language speakers, they'll say, yeah, like, you know, in Dakota, creator is a terrible translation for what that word is. It is a terrible translation. And our language speakers know that. I think many of us who don't know the language that well don't necessarily know that. So that's my provocation.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I think that's such a really important thing too, because when we try to delineate and talk about like sacred and spiritual, like I've had people, lots of filmmakers, documentary filmmakers, want to study my nation because of the tar sands and the fight of our nation trying to protect our lands and territory. And they're like, we really want to talk to your spiritual leaders. And I'm always like, what do you mean? I don't know how to respond to that, because like, in what context do you mean? Because like for me, we are all like being on the land and being in relationship with these places. That's a spiritual thing. So is that who you want? You want to talk to land users? And they're like, well, are they spiritual leaders? I'm like, I think like you're thinking of some sort of like woo-y like thing where you get to go and participate in some ceremony where your mind gets blown and like something magical happens as spirituality. And for our community, like it is literally just about being in relationship. It is about being in relationship with the land. And they're like, well, do you have people that are like medicine people? And I was like, anyone that speaks the language and knows the land is a medicine person. Berries, and we get together and we participate in ways to like all come together to share this knowledge. But there's no like ultimate shaman in our community, no spiritual leader. There might be wise elders that we take counsel with, but it's not the same as the context of the way that we talk about sacred and spirituality in English. It doesn't contextualize back into what it means in our communities, because it still plays on these systems of Western ideologies of like hierarchy and like who's at the top, who is the ultimate person in the communities, as opposed to relate communities of reciprocity and kinship. And like, that's for me has been such an interesting journey, because like so many filmmakers, I want to talk to the spiritual leaders in your community. And I'm like, I don't know, I'll connect you with my cousin. He's really great. He does a lot of harvesting of medicines and animals. And they're like, oh, he's a spiritual leader. I'm like, sure. And so it's just like a way of contextualizing the challenges we have in understanding, like we might all be speaking English, but like Kim hit the nail on the head. Our languages and the way that they're contextualized back into English are terrible translations, and it's just impossible to bring these two things together sometimes.
That makes me wonder too if you talked about like the split between the material and the spiritual and how that becomes a part of that spiritual language. And I wonder too if when Indigenous knowledge is then made always into the spiritual, that the material gets lost, and that helps people to then not think about the material aspects that you talked about in your presentation, Eriel, about how in order for Indigenous knowledge to be part of, or to be incorporated as they might into like environmental assessments or whatever they're doing, Indigenous people need to have like access to and control over, control is not the right word again, the land in order to be able to practice the things that are contained in Indigenous knowledge systems.
Do you want to respond at all, Kim? I mean,
I was the one of the main things that strikes me is if settlers can persist in their spirit material worldview, they can, also the culture nature divide, right? They can then just like allow us to smudge or dance or put on beads and dance around in public and do a traditional opening to a conference, but they don't actually have to give anything back. Like, and it's actually kind of important to give land back and governance authorities back and things like that. It's just not simply enough to allow people to say a prayer and open the day in a good way. And that spirit material divide perpetuates that refusal to give anything material back. Yeah, it's very, very self-serving of them. So,
I mean, yes, all of that. It's a real big challenge. And within the structures of like, even when we start talking about economics and structures of power and how things are determined, we've seen like grand openings of like, new economic centers where they like bring in some elder to come and do the prayer. And then they say, oh, we're committing to like 3% of the task force to be like Indigenous employers. But our communities didn't have a say in those economic centers coming there. We didn't have a say in all of these things because Canada, particularly I'll speak to Canada because that's what I know, we haven't had systems that actually uphold Indigenous peoples as being able to have control. Like there's this paternalistic relationship between the colonial government and Indigenous peoples where they know what's best for us. And they've tried to say, oh, we have great relationships and we want to bring you in and hear what you have to say. But it's only to like, it's a tokenistic lip service structure that we have that doesn't really actually, where there is that material and spiritual divide. We want your spirituality because we want to feel good about bringing to the table, but we're not willing to share the material wealth that exists from the extraction from your territories and lands and territory. But we're going to feel good because we're showing people we're in relationship with you, but it's not the kinds of relationships that we have and that are at the core values of our communities.
That makes me think a bit about how actually material Indigenous economy and Indigenous spirituality is. Like when we talk about protocol or giving, like there's so much giving and there's so much giving in ceremony and there's so much exchange between people, and it's very material. Like you don't just say thank you, you show that thank you with material. I wonder if either of you have something to say about that and how that can help us think through what an economy is.
I don't know what to say about. I wrote something called I wrote these 100 word vignettes called Sufficiency, about a giveaway, but I don't remember it now, but it was about, yeah, I don't remember. I agree. That's all I can say. It is very material. I don't know, Eriel, do you have anything, any response?
I mean, yes, I I also feel the same. I'm like, I think of giveaway culture. I think of like the fact, like when I would spend time with my grandmother before she passed away, who barely spoke any English. When I'd leave, she always wanted to like gift me something, because that's in this sort of like foundation of like reciprocity, right? And I think it's made me think of sort of Robin Wall Kimmerer's essay that she wrote this past year on the serviceberry and economy of abundance. So really looking at generosity and reciprocity as the core parts of like Indigenous gift economy. So there's a line here like gratitude and reciprocity are the currency of a gift economy. And they have the remarkable property of multiplying with every exchange, their energy concentrating as they pass from hand to hand, a truly renewable resource. I accept the gift from the bush and then spread that gift with the dish of berries to my neighbor, who makes a pie to share with his friend, who feels so wealthy in food and friendship that he volunteers at the food pantry. You know how it goes. And like, this is part of this idea of like this giving economy, this abundance economy that we have, that is so separated from this idea of a monetary economy, and that it is about being in relationship and about sharing the material wealth of the world, and not relegating those things to some sort of like wooey spirituality thing, but they are a part of the material and like relationship wealth that exists and has existed in our communities for thousands of years.
Yeah, I was thinking that the not giving part comes out of a logic of scarcity, right? And scarcity, this believing is that the world is ultimately a place filled with scarcity promotes hoarding, actually. And that's a lot of what we're doing. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I presume you could talk a lot about traditional Western economics as a kind of a doctrine of scarcity and hoarding. Yeah, it does
Absolutely.
not. Yeah.
Like Western economic systems are predicated on this idea of scarcity and hoarding 100%. And like even within the realm of philanthropy and activism, it's always like, oh my God, we don't have enough. We don't have enough. We don't have enough. We need to collect more. We need to collect more. And the difference between in our communities is that the land will feed you. The land will provide for you. Your community will provide for you. The fact that my community still has like community freezers is this idea that the hunter goes out and hunts, but he doesn't hunt so that he fills just his freezer. He fills the community freezer. And there's just this taking care of each other. And I just want to say just for a second, so folks understand like how much of a core value this is. We have like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, right? But there are some folks that are like, why do Indigenous peoples need separate rights? We all have human rights under the Convention of, Human Rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, and our Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm like, yes. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created in 1946. And many Indigenous peoples did not have personhood. So we were not even involved or consulted or included in what it meant to have human rights. And as Indigenous peoples began to have more voice and say and recognition as human, literally, because prior to that, we were like literally classified as flora and fauna. If there were abuses, molestation, murders to Indigenous peoples, it didn't matter because we weren't human. And as we began to be recognized as human, Indigenous folks recognized that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights didn't actually encompass what it meant to be Indigenous, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is predicated on individual rights, the individual rights of the person, which we absolutely need. But it misses the mark on the fact that humanity at its core, when we break it down, we live in kinship and relationship, and that we have collective rights with each other in our communities and collective within our natural environments. And that is part of the tenets that is held up within the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it moves away from this idea of hyper individualism, of trying to have hyper individualism, accumulation of wealth, notoriety, all of these things, and it moves more in a collective framework that has to be developed on abundance and taking care of each other. And so we move away from scarcity because it's not just you, it's you and your community.
Do you have
Are you
more,
gonna say
Kira?
something?
No, I mean, I could, but yeah, I do find it interesting. Also, these movements in certain parts of the world to say, I don't know if it's coming out of a human rights framework to recognize the personhood of rivers. Like, is that because, of course, we would consider many of these entities persons, but I wonder, I mean, human rights doesn't begin to capture, it's because it's probably human centric, right? And those are not the only relatives we care about. So it's probably, this is not, I don't deal with human rights literatures or discourse, but I would presume it's inadequate for those, for the relational integrity as well of our non-human relatives, I would assume, based on what you're saying, Eriel.
Oh yeah, there are some real challenges with the personhood of like natural places like rivers and mountains. It sounds great, but it sort of relegates the differentiation between like humanity versus like the river or the mountain. Whereas Indigenous cosmology, it's about kinship. Like it's so funny because like I grew up with this as a core value, and to know that like every blade of grass, every tree in the forest, all the birds and the fish in the water, to the rocks, to the moon, to the sky and the stars were my relatives. And that I was a part of like a system of life. You know, very like Lion King for white folks.
Yeah.
There's a way to relate it to you. But like, that's how I grew up. And when I became like a teenager and a young adult in the world, and to recognize that like 90% of society does not have that as a core understanding or value, it totally makes sense why extractivism and predatory capitalism is the structure that our society is built on, because they don't see those things as kin. They see them as things to develop individual wealth. The American dream is predicated on like extraction and hoarding as systems of scarcity, because you need to make sure that you're taken care of, because otherwise someone else is going to take it from you, as opposed to a relationship of kinship and community. And again, the personhood stuff just further divides, separates us. It's like putting things into categories as opposed to building intersectional understanding of what it means to like live. I think live on this planet is probably the only way I can say it.
Eriel, something that I thought of when you were doing your presentation was when you talked about how 80% of the world's biodiversity is on Indigenous peoples' territories. I think when a lot of general audiences hear that, they might be picturing like the reason for this is because Indigenous peoples live with like nothing, or, you know, like they live so lightly on the land in like teepees or something. And that is why the biodiversity exists there. And I wonder if you or Kim can say more about how Indigenous economies actually do have an impact in encouraging that biodiversity, and not just because we live so lightly or something.
I mean, Indigenous people do live lower carbon lifestyles than sort of settler society, but it's not in teepees and smoke signals. Like a lot of the time within the work within the climate movement that Indigenous Climate Action does, when we talk about the like reemergence or the valuing of Indigenous knowledge and ways of being as climate solutions, people are like, oh, so you want us to go live in teepees and communicate with smoke signals. But again, like I said, Indigenous peoples are not static. We're not frozen in time. And that we live in urban centers. You know, we love or hate social media just as much as anyone else, like all of these things. And our cultures and our life ways have also evolved along with us. That needs to be understood, that we have evolved. We are not some static peoples that are not moving things forward. And like any other peoples on the planet, when new technologies or innovations that we also created pre-colonization arise, or come forward that continue to uphold our values and make things easier or more accommodating, our peoples have always found ways to incorporate them into our lives. You know, like when rubber was created by a different nation down here, it's not like we said, oh, that's not in our spiritual practice and we're never going to use it. It was like, oh, that's cool. What could we use it for? And there was these adoptions. And even within colonization, you know, we adopted, many folks were like, wow, the rifle's pretty cool. We're going to use that. Or people were like, sugar, that's amazing. I want some of that. And so there's this idea that we have, and we continue to adopt these ideas like Western two-eyed seeing approaches, which sometimes I have trouble with, because the idea of this Western two-eyed seeing approach still holds Western science as the highest form. But the reality is Indigenous peoples have actually, we've embodied two-eyed seeing approach by adopting a lot of like Western academia, science, methodologies, all technologies, but there's been this reluctance because Indigenous ways of being are barbaric, they're backwards, they're no value. And that comes from that premise of the colonization of the Americas before we were humans, before we were considered anything, that we were demonized, devalued, and there was an attempt to completely eradicate us. And we were like pariahs, that we were to be feared and demonized. And that means all of those lifeways along with it. And so when we talk about the types of innovations that we can bring forward into these new economies, it's about reimagining what it would be like to center those value systems within those structures for tomorrow. So within climate solutions, because that's what I know more about, and within the work of ICA, is that you look at communities that are like, what's a climate solution after deconstructing root causes, colonization, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, all of those things. And you start talking about the values of your community, people are like, we need to make sure our young people are language speakers, because then they'll know the land, then they'll know what it means to be a part of these things. And then they're like, we need to build an elders and youth lodge to do this intergenerational transmission of knowledge. And they'll build the structure, they'll get their people back on the land, they'll bring their language, they'll nurture it, and they'll nurture these experiential experiences of transmission of knowledge. And they'll also build that structure with renewable energy. And this is like bringing this two-eyed seeing approach. But people within the climate movement, they only count that solar panel as a climate solution. They don't think about how that language and the expirational transmission of knowledge and that material exchanges of being on the land and revitalizing the kinship with species is actually part of solutions, and that needs to be valued in society. It gets left out of what economic systems can look like, because it doesn't have that dollar amount that we can capitalize and put into a spreadsheet and evaluate within the current structures. And so it's reimagining what those values are and how we determine what is contributing to our economic systems.
Kim, do you have any thoughts from that? I
was just listening like.
I know, me too. What that brought up for me is you're talking about two-eyed seeing, and I think it's interesting. Like, it also doesn't, it doesn't, what am I trying to say, fit for me that well. Is also like when I think about what you're saying about two-eyed seeing, I feel like the second eye, that Western science or whatever, that Western eye is just the ability to like strip down all those things and say, like, you know, we're going to put this budget, we're going to say we did the solar panel. Like, that's what the Western eye is. It's just the ability to put it into that like stripped down language where everything else is left out, rather than actually like a different knowledge system. Does that make sense? And I like the way that you said that, because it helped me to think through, like, why is it that two-eyed seeing doesn't work for me?
Do you have another term then, Kira?
No.
I know, I'm trying to think of one too.
I don't really have one either, but it definitely has been bothering me lately a lot.
I mean, we say in our Indigenous STS program that any knowledge that Indigenous people use in order to thrive as collectivities, and the collectivity is very important, is Indigenous knowledge. I mean, this is one of the things that I'm having a crisis of faith about. I think we we absolutely must promote the survival of the collective. It is not about the survival of individual Indigenous people. It is about the collective. And individuals have to put their own hurt feelings and disconnectedness behind. They have to deprioritize that, and the collective is the priority. And if people can't, and I worry that too many people can't see that, that there are too many people who could connect with and reconnect with their Indigenous collectives who are too lost in individualism and a settler worldview. And they need to figure out how to deal with that. So to me, the collective is what is most important. It is more important than us as individuals, because that is how that is how worldviews get carried forward. That is how language survives. And we must be very clear. So any knowledge we're producing or using in the service of the survival of these collectivities, to me, is Indigenous knowledge. And anyway, so that's kind of the things I'm going to, and it is very hard, I think, to disentangle the individualism from the collectivism. It's very hard in this society in which we are rewarded as individuals. I am exhausted by words like success and excellence. I don't care anymore. Of course, it's easy for me to say I don't care. I'm 52 years old. I'm in a different position than a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old. I recognize that. But I really am not interested in those individualistic measures anymore. They're doing nothing for us. They're doing nothing for us as a people. And so I'm trying to figure out then how are you in the academy and rejecting that kind of language? Or maybe how are you in any institution that's a settler kind of designed institution and rejecting that language? And that's kind of the work in front of me right now, because I don't believe in the core values anymore of what the academy thinks it espouses. I think it's very individualistic and it's very anti-collectivist to the core. So then what do we do with that, right? But I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question yet. I'll sort of hope to figure that out in the next few years.
If you figure it out, can you share with everyone?
Yeah, no, I'm going to write about this. But yeah.
I think that's a really, really important point, because, you know, the current problem is that we're constantly measuring. Like, I wrote a post the other day about privilege, and like we talk about privilege all the time in our society. We're like, oh, white privilege, you know, you have the privilege of doing these things. But the problem is that even when we talk about privilege, it is centered around white supremacy and colonial and settler colonial states. It's about like, oh, you had the privilege of like getting, you know, having material wealth within the context of settler colonial ideas of like access to Western academia and like educational degrees within that. You lived in a nice house with a family that didn't have to worry about money. Like, those are all of the ideas of privilege. Like, when we have these, used to do these things where I would talk about oppression, where we measure like, did both your parents, did anyone in your family graduate from university? Did you live in more than 5 houses? Like, all of these things. And it's like, that means like you didn't have the same privileges and this other person had all the privileges. And then we say to our people, we didn't have those privileges growing up, to our younger generations, as if to say that the things that we had as Indigenous peoples were not privileges, right? That knowing the land, speaking the language, knowing our wild foods and our medicines, and that the lands are our kin are not privileges. We center privilege as something to be attained within the white settler colonial lens. And it's the same thing when we talk about economic structures. We still center this idea around being at that center of what white settler economic systems and structures look like, what white success looks like, light-skinned, having money, having material wealth, all of those things are caught up in the center. And we continue to get further and further away from actually saying, I don't want that privilege. Like, for me, F that, I don't need that privilege. The privilege that I have is that I know the land. The privileges that I have is that I'm learning the language again that was ripped out of my dad's literally mouth as a child in residential schools. I am finding these things over and over again. And it's so important that we recenter these ideas of what success is, what privilege is, to value other things outside of the scope of settler colonial lens and systems of white supremacy. Otherwise, we're just at risk to continue to repeat these things and keep going down the way and talk about Western TwoEyed Seeing knowing, which again, as you said, Kira, is literally just about recentering like white systems and structures in there as opposed to valuing our own.
We're reaching the end of our time. Do either of you want to give us any last thoughts before we end off?
Well, you're asking us?
Yes.
There was a land acknowledgement question. What do we think about land acknowledgements? I actually was at a theater last Christmas before COVID hit in Edmonton, a community theater. And they had a really cool land acknowledgement. It was non-Indigenous theater. And they talked about what their theater and institution is doing in terms of beyond, like, what does that mean? What is a land acknowledgement and where they are in Treaty 6 territory? What does that mean for their programming? What does it mean for their community outreach? And it took a few minutes, but I really liked hearing programmatically what they were doing. I thought that was the coolest land acknowledgement I'd ever heard. So anyway, I think we're at the point where we need to go beyond just the acknowledgement. They work best in places where people are shocked by them. So I did one at Duke University a couple of years ago, and people were just like, what? Like, and I had a map of the Indigenous peoples whose land, and they were like, oh, we didn't know there were like 7 tribes in this, you know. It was, so that worked there, but it doesn't work in Treaty 6 anymore. You got to do something else. So
I think, yeah, this is totally relational to where you are, but I think it's really important for folks to understand where we are and to understand like the original peoples that were there and like the history of the dispossession, marginalization of those people. And like, again, I don't even like the term marginalization because it's marginal to what? Marginal to centering white supremacist colonial values. That's what it's marginal from. But like when we talk about economic systems and ecological economics, just to close things up, is that it's really important to understand that a lot of the stuff that's emerging within this idea of ecological economics is a regurgitation and a rebranding and a repackaging of Indigenous systems that existed pre-colonization. And just like many of the innovations that existed pre-contact, like the syringe and the baby bottle and rubber, those things were appropriated by colonists and systems of white supremacy and repackaged as something that was theirs. And there was no recognition to that. And we can't risk these same things from happening and continuing to perpetuate. And so the idea of Indigenous economics is less around getting the quantitative and qualitative data to prove how Indigenous economic systems are going to like be better than current capitalist structures, but it's about recentering relationships within that. And that relationships, interconnectedness, ecosystems, the stuff that gets talked about in ecological economics is at the core of Indigenous value systems. And we have to reimagine those futures tomorrow. And we can't just be doing what Kim said, which is like just giving the land acknowledgement. What is the substantive things that you're going to do to move forward beyond in your programs to actually give recognition and have those exchanges beyond just being like recognizing the spirituality that Indigenous people bring, and where is the exchange of the materiality within those contexts. And within that, of course, I have to plug ICA is having our conference June 10th to 11th, and you can check it out on our website, indigenousclimateaction.com. Our registration is closed for non-Indigenous folks, but if you are Indigenous and you'd like to register, you can check that out on the website. You can email our coordinator at research@indigenousclimateaction.com. But this conference is going to be profiling Indigenous folks that are talking about food security, healing justice, ransom economies, all of the things that we face in just transition, in the ways in which we face what it means to reimagine these new economies moving forward. So I just had to plug that. So that's my last pitch for the day. It's been really exciting, and I'm just so honored to be able to speak on a panel with you, Kim. I absolutely love your work, and this has been such a lovely conversation. And of course, Kiera, thank you so much as well.
thank you. I've learned a lot from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you both. This is my first time moderating a panel, and it was such an awesome experience. Just getting to talk with you both, who I admire. And Jodi?
Thank you so much, all three of you, and for everyone who's been listening in. I just want to acknowledge how vital it is for those of us engaged at CANC and who dabble in anything called ecological economics to be having this conversation, to honor it and allow it to be an intact conversation where we who identify in settler community or are non-Indigenous people listening in have a practice of actually sitting and listening. I've been in other situations where, you know, the listening is in concentric circles and the folks in the center are really the ones who are talking, and community sits around, and it can last for 8, 9, 10 hours. I think it's a really good practice for us to sit in here like that. And it was a little bit one of those like fly on the wall conversations that it's interesting to have because, you know, we were able to create this space for the three of you. I'm really hoping that folks don't just feel good about hearing stuff that sounded really profound to you, but that you will really take some of these key ideas home with you and reflect deeply on how that's going to show up in your work and how you're going to challenge yourself to think differently about categorization and the need for Indigenous leadership in these conversations and circles. Because if we're coming at this feeling like there's something new about what we're doing and it doesn't have this connection to a deeper innate knowledge, and recognize that, you know, it's not going to be people who look like me who are going to bring these ideas forward and into fruition, and that we have to learn how to line up our resources behind the folks who are out there to do the work, pass the mic, and step up profoundly in ways that next time you don't have to see me in a conversation like this at all, involved in a CANSI conference. So that's sort of my wish moving forward for 2023.